Kathy was primarily living in the East 86th Street apartment. Bob Durst was primarily living in the Riverside Drive apartment. And like many domestic violence relationships, they still would see each other. In fact, when we get there, Kathy is going to be killed by Bob Durst when they are spending the weekend together in South Salem. The evidence is going to show no one forced Kathy to go there. But that's what you're going to be shown. That's what the evidence is going to demonstrate. The letter continues that this attitude is no longer realistic, and at this time, a divorce seems the only possibility. And this is back March 27th, 1981. And the countdown has started. The evidence is going to show that by the time we get to March 27th, 1982, Kathy's going to be dead. The letter continues. When we moved to East 86th Street, I brought with me most of the personal belongings I had accumulated at this time. I would like them returned, specifically books, records, clothes. I think there are a couple of jackets and boots in the hall closet, artwork, none of which has monetary value, documents, letters, etc. in my desk. Further, the following pieces of furniture. So that's where things stood in March. By the fall of '81, the domestic violence is worsening. Sometime, it appears in September, they were having an argument in their penthouse at Riverside Drive. And in the middle of a rainstorm, Kathy climbs out the window onto a balcony, and she sought refuge in the neighboring penthouse, in the residence. Now, what you're going to see next is going to be a reenactment in the movie All Good Things of this incident. So again, these are actors and actresses recreating this incident, but what's going to be important are going to be Bob Durst's comments about it as he is watching.
Maybe she thought she'd get me to, have a child with her, but that she wouldn't be just the passive one, and this would give her some control over me.
Yeah.
This is more or less accurate. I don't know why she would go in our neighbor's window as opposed to go to their door. But it was pouring, and we were having a wrestling, shoving type fight. And she ran out on the terrace and ran into their apartment. Said she was afraid to come home. Said she didn't want to go home. She doesn't have to come home.
Did the neighbor have a door on the same terrace, or the neighbor?
Yes. We shared the top terrace. We were in the front overlooking Riverside Drive. They were in the back.
Oh, I see. When she said she was afraid to come home, did you feel like that was something she was saying to the neighbor as a kind of a way of making things public or trying to pressure you, or did you feel like she was really afraid to come home?
I had no idea. I didn't really care one way or the other what she did. It was late and I was just tired.
You remember what the fight was about?
No.
Were there subjects that became, the typical subjects you would fight about?
Well, like where we were going or where we weren't going, or whether we were going to go to South Salem for the weekend or not, like that.
Now the evidence is going to show that almost without exception, Mr. Durst not only does not deny these incidents of domestic violence, he freely admits them. And in addition, the evidence will show he doesn't just admit them once. He will come back at different times and he will reiterate the same information, as he did during the subsequent interviews in 2010 with Mr. Jarecki.
When we were talking about the terrace incident, or her climbing out onto the terrace during the you said that they came over and they said, well, she's afraid to come home, or the neighbor.
And she's afraid to come home.
And your reaction to that was to say, well, she doesn't want to come home. She doesn't have to
She doesn't have to come home. She's got the other apartment over on 86th Street. She wants me to get out of here so she can get some stuff together. Whatever she wants to do, she can do. I don't care.
And when you said you didn't care, what did that mean? You didn't care?
It's late at night. I'm tired. And, I want to go to sleep. She can do whatever she wants to do.
Was that a big fight compared to other incidents between
It was a
you?
mini fight. The fact that she climbed out the window made it a big fight, but that wasn't a big thing. It didn't go on long. All of a sudden, she's climbing out the window. I was already, getting ready to go to bed.
Ann Anderson Doyle and her husband Kevin occupied that adjacent penthouse at 37 Riverside Drive. She's going to come and testify. She's going to fly out here from Australia, where they now live. And she's going to tell you that in the middle of the night, in a rainstorm, Kathy's pounding on their window, terrified. She's going to tell you that Kathy told her that Bob Durst had beaten and that he had threatened her. She's going to tell you that Kathy said she literally feared for her life. And the evidence is going to show that Kathy told her that Durst had a gun and that she was afraid that he was going to shoot her. She's going to further tell you that while they were talking, Kathy was crying and terrified. She was so afraid that she didn't want to be in the bedroom where there was a window where potentially someone could see in. And then literally, they went inside. It's a tiny, basically it's a studio penthouse. The Doyle's penthouse is very small. And she's going to tell you they went in the bathroom and they're basically cowering in the bathroom as Kathy is telling her this story, crying and terrified. That was Kathy's life about 5 months before he was going to kill her. Now, this incident was not reported to police at the time. And the evidence is going to show that back in 1981, we were a different society than we are today. That domestic violence happened and oftentimes it never got reported. The police don't find out about this until after Kathy disappears on January 31st, 1982, and they go back and they're now interviewing people. Detective James Varian, you're going to hear his videotaped testimony as well. And at the time that he testified, which is within the last couple of years, he is reading from the report that he and his partner authored years ago. So obviously we're talking to him at a time where it's almost 40 years after the incident. He's going to say that his report related that Ann said that she let her in, meaning Kathy, told her that Bob had beat her and that he wanted to kill her. And that Kathy told Ann, who told the detective, that Durst had a gun and Kathy was afraid of being shot. Janet Fink Shaw was another friend of Kathy's. She's also going to testify. She was also their former housekeeper in South Salem. So remember, Bob and Kathy had 3 different residences, and 2 are in Manhattan and 1 is in South Salem. So the South Salem house, Janet Fink would clean it, but over time she became less kind of a house cleaner and more of a friend. She became a friend to both Bob and Kathy. And when she testifies, she's going to tell you that she liked both of them. She liked Kathy and she liked Bob. She's also going to tell you that Kathy described the Riverside Drive incident to her, what had happened.
the Riverside apartment, or the 86th Street apartment, and moved back over to go stay at the Riverside apartment. And so they had an argument, and she tried to get out of the room, and she tried to escape through the window. There was like a roof kind of decking that went over to the other apartment, which there was only two on the top, and he pulled her back through the windows, and she told me how, her legs were just totally scraped, and, he wouldn't let her get out of the apartment. And I remember being really horrified at that point, and, I always told her, I said, listen, my advice was she should get like a serious dog, and one that was already trained, and, she needed to just, plan her escape and just go, and don't even worry about the money, because that's always my philosophy. Just leave and don't even think about those things. You have to think about your safety, and obviously I was worried about her safety because, yes, that was just one conversation of a physical situation, and, that sounded super scary.
Now, the evidence is going to show that at the time that she was killed, Kathy was a fourth-year medical student. She's almost a doctor. She's going to graduate in a matter of months. And the evidence is going to show that Kathy's a strong woman. She's nobody's doormat. But the evidence is also going to show that, like a lot of strong women, she was a victim of someone who was abusing her. And she made the decision to remain in the relationship. And the evidence is going to show that that decision is going to cost her her life. January 6, 1982. The evidence will show this is now 24 days before Bob Durst is going to kill her. On that date, she goes to Jacobi Medical Center. You're going to hear evidence that Jacobi Medical Center was a part of Albert Einstein, the medical school Kathy went to. So Kathy, who's a young medical student, who's actually doing rotations at Albert Einstein, she's doing rotations at this hospital. The evidence is going to show that she literally goes there and she explains to them that she has been a victim of domestic violence. Now, the evidence is going to show that she does not tell the doctor that Bob Durst is the one who did it. And again, the evidence will demonstrate that, like a lot of women in that situation, she was afraid and embarrassed, and she didn't reveal who her batterer was. So she goes to the hospital. She is treated. Bob Durst is later questioned about this by Andrew Jarecki in 2010, excuse me. I keep saying 11. Let me be clear. If I'm saying 2010, there are 3 interviews, December 11th, 12th, and 13th of 2010. The last interview is April 18, 2012. I don't know why I keep saying 2011. Mr. Milius scolded me at lunch, and now I did it again. So if I say 2011, that is a mistake on my part. So Mr. Durst is going to be confronted about that visit to the hospital. But the way that it is done, Mr. Jarecki does not show Mr. Durst the information that he has. He doesn't let Mr. Durst know, here's what I know. He asks him about it. And at that time, this is what Mr. Durst said.
Did you ever create any marks on her face, or did you create that?
No, I never saw any marks on her face, and I wouldn't hit her in the face.
Did you, if you were going to have a physical altercation with her, what would typically happen?
Pushing and shoving and get out of here, or whatever it was. That would be the physical altercation. Falling down now and then, but I never hit her in the face. I never saw anything on her face, and neither did anybody else ever see anything on her face.
Now, the evidence will show, as you heard from the clip, that Mr. Durst did not deny that he would assault Kathy. What he said was, I never hit her in the face, and if you watched, he then made a move punching forward with his fists. That's what he was confronted with, but that's not the end of the story.
So your sense of this Jacoby Hospital visit is that if the guys at Jacoby Hospital wrote a report that said that she
I
had...
never saw any such report. The police didn't either. And the way I found out about Jacoby Hospital was not from Kathy, but after Kathy disappeared, then it was brought up either by Gilberti or the police, and they asked these questions you're asking.
So Mr. Durst absolutely denied that that incident ever happened. However, there's a report from the hospital, January 6, 1982. You're going to actually hear from the physician who treated Kathy. If you look at the report, what the report says is 29-year-old female with history of blunt trauma to left side of face. Patient allegedly slapped with hand. That's what she told the doctor. You're going to hear from that doctor. That doctor's going to tell you that back in 1982, it was not unusual for women to come in, professional women, and to not identify their abuser. And you're going to learn something else, that Kathy was going in to the very hospital where she worked at as a doctor, a medical student. That very hospital. But not as a medical student, as a victim. And that she was ashamed and embarrassed. Now, though the medical forms do not indicate who assaulted Kathy, Kathy was legally married to Bob Durst at this time. They were married at the time he killed her. Yet, the evidence will show...
That's the third time, Judge. I've got to object to this conclusion that he repeats. That is that Bob Durst killed Kathy Bird.
The evidence is going to show very clearly and unequivocally and beyond any doubt that Bob Durst killed Kathy Durst. That's what the evidence will show in this case.
Argument, Your Honor.
Now, as I was saying, they were legally married at the time, yet on the admission slip, Kathy listed her mother as her next of kin. Dr. Peter Halperin is also going to testify by video. And again, we covered this in voir dire, so the reason that you're seeing images of individuals is that they ended up, when you see him on the witness stand, he was a witness. He testified at a prior hearing, and that hearing, both sides have stipulated, is going to be utilized instead of his trial testimony. You're seeing Dr. Halperin as he looks now, but Dr. Halperin was a classmate of Kathy's, and he's going to describe what happened during a rotation they had together. He's going to tell you that they did the same radiology rotation. So you're going to hear from these doctors who are going to come in here, who went to medical school with Kathy. They're all doctors now. Many are even retired because it's been almost 40 years. They're going to come in, and Dr. Halperin's going to tell you that he remembers this radiology rotation. He remembers Kathy Durst. And he's going to tell you that that rotation, the evidence will show that that took place December 24th of 1981 to January 24th of 1982. Now, he's not going to be able to tell you the exact day that these incidents occurred, but he's going to tell you during that month-long period, this is what happened. He's going to say that one day during the rotation, Kathy had what appeared to him to be some kind of panic attack.
There was a particular interaction that she was having with one of the professors, the attending radiologist, who was asking her some basic questions. And she could barely speak. And it was crystal clear to me that she was petrified. That she was having some kind of near panic attack. And in fact, this attending said, "What's wrong?" And I said, "It's clear that this is before the conversation about her husband, so I had the faintest idea what she could be so frightened about. I didn't think it was not knowing the answer to the question, though. It was just so completely out of proportion. She looked absolutely fear-struck and on the verge of a full-blown panic attack. And maybe that was a signal to her that I was somebody she could talk to.
Now, Dr. Halpern's going to tell you that when you're doing rotations as a medical student in your last year of medical school, you're going to be applying for a residency when you're done. So it's really important because you need to impress the doctors that you're working with. And the doctors will, in what's commonly called pimping, the doctors will pimp the medical students with all kinds of questions while they're doing rounds. And it can be very stressful. But he's going to tell you that that wasn't what this response was about. He's going to tell you that Kathy, who was normally she was a little bit older of a medical student than most of the others that she was with. This is really out of character for her. He had not seen it before, and she was extremely upset. Now, he's going to tell you that after that time, he's at home later that evening with his wife, Martha. You're going to also hear her testimony as well. He's going to tell you that he received a phone call from Kathy. And he's going to tell you he and Kathy were not close. He hardly knew her. They weren't really friends. But he's going to describe this call from Kathy.
And when she called you up on the phone, can you describe what her demeanor was?
She was petrified. Her voice was shaky.
When you say petrified, can you explain a little bit?
Well, her voice was shaking. She was clearly very anxious. She was talking a little bit with kind of pressured speech. She was clearly very upset. I didn't hear her cry, but both her words and the contents of her conversation, kind of were the same. She was telling me that he had really viciously beat up this guy, and that she was worried that he would beat her up or hurt her. And I didn't ask more details. I didn't ask, has he hit you yet? I only wanted to get her the hell out of there. It was so clear that it was dangerous. It was just totally clear.
Kathy didn't leave. The evidence is going to show that in the middle of this divorce, Kathy wanted what she believed was a fair settlement. And she was not going to leave the marriage without getting what she thought she was entitled to. Now, by 1982, by this time, Bob Durst was basically living in the Riverside Drive penthouse. Kathy was living in East 86th Street, which again was much closer to the hospital. In January of '82, the property manager at East 86th Street was Karen Minatello. Now, Bob and Kathy had a pretty large two-bedroom apartment at East 86th Street. Karen Minatello, again, she testified previously. You're going to hear her videotaped testimony. Karen Minatello is going to tell you that about 2 weeks before Kathy's disappearance, Kathy called her.
She called me and she was a little vague at first, but then she started out asking if there was an empty apartment in the building because she wanted to rent her own apartment. And I didn't have anything at the time. And then she started talking a little more personal, like she really needed to move out of the apartment with him, and could I let her or her sister know as soon as there was anything available. And did she say why? She indicated she just needed to get away from him.
Despite the tensions, the domestic violence, and the situation that was clearly spiraling downhill, Kathy still saw Bob Durst. Apparently, the evidence is still cared for him. And they still spent time together. And one of those times was Sunday, January 31st, 1982. They were together at the Lakeside Cottage in South Salem, New York. January 31st, 1982 would also be the last day of Kathy's life, because that evening, her husband Bob was going to kill her. Now that afternoon, Kathy went to a party at her friend Gilberta Najami's house. Gilberta Najami is since deceased, and that was in Connecticut. Now, for the geography, so that you understand, where she lived in Connecticut was about 45 minutes to an hour away from South Salem, New York. It's basically Westchester County is on the border. So Kathy ended up going to a party at Gilberta's, and this is actually Gilberta's parents' house. You're going to hear from Fadwa Najami, who is Gilberta's sister. She's going to testify in this case. Now, while at the party, Kathy calls up Peter Schwartz. If you remember, Peter Schwartz is the guy that Bob had assaulted about a year earlier. And there was a civil suit that Kathy was aware about. Now, during this call, they discussed the civil suit that Peter Schwartz had filed against Durst related to that assault. Peter took notes during the conversation and testified about what had happened. He said that Kathy expressed her strong desire that Peter proceed with his civil suit against Durst. Peter responded that he had settled the litigation. So basically, he had come to an agreement with Bob Durst, a settlement, and that case was going to go away. He's going to tell you that Kathy made very clear that she was very upset as a result of the settlement because she was not going to be able to use the assault as leverage in her divorce.
They want to hear.
And when she was asking this, Peter, did it sound like she was a concerned wife trying to make sure that her husband was not going to suffer any adverse consequences, or did it seem like something else?
Yeah, that's very funny. No, she was not coming off as a concerned wife.
What was she? What was she coming off as, Peter?
I mean, to me, what it was about was that she wanted more that she could utilize for her benefit of whatever it is that she was trying to accomplish. And it wasn't to repair her marriage. At least that was my impression.
So basically what you're saying is, it sounds like your take was Kathy was hoping to utilize your situation for leverage in her dealings with her husband, and it did not involve saving their marriage.
Absolutely.
Peter Schwartz is going to testify. He's going to tell you that Kathy made it very clear that she was aggravated during the call.
I do recall that she appeared to be very aggravated over the phone.
And aggravated, in other words, aggravated just in general, or kind of aggravated based on she was not hearing what she wanted to hear from you?
I would say both. She seemed to be aggravated in general, and she seemed to be aggravated that I wasn't giving her what she wanted.
Now, Bob Durst is going to be questioned in 2010 by Andrew Jarecki regarding his conversations with Kathy while she was at Gilberta's that Sunday afternoon. And he's going to freely admit that they spoke on the phone.
Right. And you spoke to her before she left the party?
Yes. I called her to remind her that, you know, we got to get up and we got to get out of here, and I'm going to take the dog back to the kennel because he had this procedure done, but it still wasn't all fixed. They said, yeah, you want to take him for the weekend. If he's good, that's terrific, but you want to bring him back on Monday. And I had this closing with Douglas. We were buying a property on 43rd Street. I think we were supposed to be there at noon.
Now, Gilberta Najami's sister, Fadwa, was also at that party. She's going to tell you that she was present when Kathy took a phone call from Bob. She's going to tell you she could not hear Bob's end of the conversation, but she could hear part of Kathy's.
Okay, there was something going on with Bobby, and she was upset about that. And the phone rang. At some point, I don't remember if it was after dinner or not. It had to be after dinner, I'm pretty sure, because I think she left the house at 7.
Mm-hmm.
Bobby called Gilberta's phone, and I remember standing on the wall next to the phone, because it was a wall-mounted phone, and she answered it. And I remember, like, watching her face, because she was being nice to him.
Did her demeanor at all change when she hung up the phone and basically...
I think she made a statement. I can't call her exactly, but it was kind of like, he's really pissed, I have to go.
Now the evidence is going to show that after the call, Kathy left. She drove from Connecticut back to the South Salem residence, which was about an hour away. Now the next day, Monday, February 1st, 1982, Kathy was supposed to begin her first day of an ambulatory pediatric clinic at Bronx Memorial Hospital. Now you're going to hear from numerous doctors that are going to come in and testify. And they're going to explain to you that as a medical student, you do different rotations. Some rotations, for instance, if you're doing a surgical rotation, you might have to stay over in the hospital. Other rotations are clinics that have more normal hours. And the rotation Kathy was due to start was her ambulatory pediatric clinic at Bronx Memorial Hospital, which is basically a part of the hospitals that are in the right next to each other as Jacoby. It's the same place. So Monday, February 1st at 9 o'clock, Kathy was supposed to show up and was supposed to be oriented. This is the planner from the doctor, the attending physician, who was supposed to be orienting Kathy along with some other doctors as well. Kathy never made it. That was February 1st, 1982. It's been now 38 years. Now, Bob Durst waited 4 days before reporting his wife missing. When he did report her missing, he reported her missing not where she had last been seen, in Westchester County, but instead he went into Manhattan and he went to the 20th precinct. He walked into the 20th precinct and he filed a missing persons report. And he was interviewed by NYP detective Mike Struck. Now, at the time of the interview, Bob Durst was holding this 2-year-old magazine titled The Men Who Own New York. That's what he was carrying in there. And one of the men, the 5 men who were on there, these are basically the titans of New York real estate at the time. One of them is Seymour Durst, Bob's father.
Went to the city. Friday morning, went to the office. Went to the police precinct that afternoon. Made a fuss about the missing person, medical school, rich person. And then they started investigating and how's the marriage doing, and I started out with not so bad, and then spoke to Gilbert and Mary and found out, it's pretty terrible.
I want to make sure that you were able to hear what Mr. Durst said. He said that they asked him how the marriage was, and he said, not so bad. And he says, then they spoke to Gilbert and Mary, Kathy's sister, and they found out, oh, it's pretty terrible. The evidence is going to show that this would just be a pattern of Bob Durst lying and obfuscating the truth. A pattern that's continued to this day. Now, the story that Bob Durst related regarding Sunday night, January 31st, was the following. He said Kathy returned from Gilberta's party. He said they had a sandwich. Durst put Kathy on a train back to New York City. He then said he visited his neighbors, that's going to be the mayors, and he wasn't doing anything nefarious. He said he spoke with Kathy by phone between 11 and 11:15 p.m. She seemed fine. she was watching TV in their Riverside Drive penthouse. So his story was Kathy made it home, and they spoke while she was at Riverside Drive in that penthouse. He said whatever happened to Kathy afterward was a result of her drug use, promiscuity, and criminal companions. Now the evidence is going to show that each of these assertions was false. The first, they had a sandwich and Durst put Kathy on a train back to New York City. However, in 2010, Durst actually admitted that they had a violent argument that night.
So the night that she disappeared, that Sunday night, or the last night that you saw her, I think, do you want to just take me through what you remember happening that night?
She gets back from the 30s, maybe 7 or whatever, angry at me, loaded, walks around the house, doing stuff, and announcing that she wants to go to the city. I said, you can go to the city if you want, but you can't drive. I'm not going to go to the city. And
She couldn't drive because of her condition, or she was...
You drive anytime. You know, her condition didn't bother me at all. We only had one car. We just had the Mercedes up there. So I wasn't going to go back Sunday night. So the car and me and the dog were staying in South Salem. You can't take the dog to the kennel Sunday night anyway, until Monday when I have to take the dog to the kennel and go into the city. So if she wants to go to the city, she can take the train. And she says, no, I'm taking the car. And I went and got the keys out of the car and told her that she's not taking the car because I'm not giving her the keys. And if I wasn't not giving her the keys because she was loaded, I mean, she'd driven back from Gilberti's house just as loaded, no problem. But this was her thing. She wants to go to the city, I'll take her to the train station. She wants to go to the city, she can call a cab, but she's not taking the car. That was an argument.
Was that argument just a verbal argument?
No, that was a pushing and shoving argument.
That statement was made by Mr. Durst on December 12, 2010 to Mr. Jarecki. He was very clear that they had a pushing and shoving argument. Now the next clip you're going to hear is from one day later. And what the evidence is going to show is that Bob Durst has a history and a problem with remembering his own lies. So the next day, one day later, this is the conversation he has with Mr. Jarecki.
We didn't have a fight, we didn't wrestle, we didn't touch with one another.
The night that
she disappeared.
Was the other day
we were on the train.
Yeah. But you did tell me in our last conversation that you did have a physical altercation that night.
I don't think I had a physical altercation that night. You're sure I told you that? Because she came home, she was yelling and screaming. I don't remember pushing. I do remember going into the bedroom and locking the door and taking a pill. I don't remember any pushing and shoving.
The Bob Durst version of the story was that he took Kathy to the train station and that she got on the train. The evidence will show, though, that there's no witnesses or evidence that Kathy ever got on that train. The only evidence that she ever made it on that train is going to come from Bob Durst. Now, Durst then visited his neighbors, and he said he wasn't doing anything nefarious. Talked to his neighbor, Bill Mayer. However, Durst's neighbor, Bill Mayer, completely impeaches this claim. He's going to testify. And what he's going to tell you is that, again, the evidence is going to show that Bob Durst literally tells the detective, I was with Bill Mayer. Of course, the detective's going to talk to Bill Mayer, you would think. Detective talks to Bill Mayer. This is what Bill Mayer says.
He just, I assume, fabricated that story without ever coming here for a drink or even discussing with us in any way. So he didn't ask us to lie for him. He just, I guess, kind of fibbed for himself.
Now, the evidence is going to show that The reason that Bob Durst makes up these stories is that he doesn't want to take and make the effort to actually remember what it was he's told other people. Because as the evidence demonstrates, and as he will tell you, is in essence, he's lived his life doing what he wants, and it's worked. Now, in 2010, the evidence is going to show that one of the big shocking details that emerged from the Jarecki and Smerling interviews is that for the first time ever, Durst is going to casually admit that the story about going back to the neighbor's house was a complete fabrication. And he's going to explain why it was he said that. And if you listen to his explanation, you're going to understand who Bob Durst is.
And then you went to the mayor's.
Yeah, that's what I told the police. I was hoping that would just make everything go away. I didn't go to the mayor's. I just took her to the train station, went home, and went to sleep.
And why would that have made everything go away?
Well, when I'm at the mayor's, they wanted to hear, what did you do? So I told them I did that. I just never got through my mind. It was like a negotiation. You tell somebody something, and well, that's it. They don't go back there. They don't look for motive. And why is he telling me this kind of thing? I thought that would get them to, leave me alone, accept the missing person, like that.
So the evidence is going to show that Bob Durst's view was that, well, if I tell them that's what it was, then they're just going to have to accept that because I'm Bob Durst. And he's going to expand upon that further in this same set of interviews on December 12th.
I don't know that I ever filled in all the little pieces of all that, but I just wanted to get it done with it. I'm going to report it, and that'll be that. I did not go through my mind that police ask oodles of questions and go here and there and everywhere. Just wasn't used to that. I was not used to somebody questioning my motive. Questioning my veracity.
Durst said he spoke with Kathy by phone between 11 and 11:15 p.m. She seemed fine and was watching TV in their Riverside Drive penthouse. Remember, these are what he originally told Detective Strzok about what had happened. Durst also spread this same story to the press back in February of 1982. He told the Post that he spoke to Kathy by telephone that Sunday night. She told him she was in bed watching TV. Told the Daily News on the same day. He spoke to his wife later in the evening by telephone. She did not indicate that anything was wrong. He said something similar to the Associated Press. Today, and by today I mean during the 2010 interviews, again, for the first time, Durst admits, you know what? I never talked to Kathy that night. That was a lie that I told to, quote, put her in the city.
Yes, that was the last part of my, the police are going to leave you alone now. I said, I called her, and I said I stopped at a payphone on the way home, or I went out for a walk later, and I called her from the payphone. She answered the phone, and that puts her in the city, and they're going to leave me alone now.
Just to clear up any possible misunderstanding, etc., Durst was specifically asked, did you speak to her that night?
Did you end up speaking to her that night?
No.
Now, the evidence is going to show that he did not report Kathy missing to the police in South Salem, even though that was the last place that he said he saw her. Now, this ensured that police focused their investigation in New York City, which was 50 miles in a whole other county from the location where the evidence suggests, the evidence, the circumstantial evidence in this case that we will present, will demonstrate that Kathy Durst never left that house. She got home and he killed her.
I'm going to report her missing. It's their problem. put her on the train, she came to the city, I don't know where she is, she's not going to medical school. There's got to be something wrong.
Now, it was going to become their problem to figure out what the truth
Police
was.
look for missing persons. What am I supposed to do?
So I was going to show that Bob Durst's wife disappears, and his response, his level of concern was to say, it's not my job, it's what the police do. He said whatever happened to Kathy afterward was a result of her drug use, promiscuity, and criminal companions. Now, it was at this point in time, again, Kathy disappears on January 31st when he kills her. Bob Durst reports her, it's a Sunday, he reports her missing on Friday, February 4th. And within a few days, he enlists the help of his trusted and close friend, Susan Berman, to be his spokesperson. He referred to her as a spokesman. Now, Durst and Susan immediately began to disparage Kathy to the police, suggesting that she had a role in her own disappearance. So, Detective Struck interviewed Robert Durst, and he says that Kathy probably got 1 or 2 grams of cocaine from Mike Burns per week. You're going to hear from Mike Burns, and Mike Burns is a person that Kathy was somewhat dating at this point in time. And it is true. And Mike Burns is going to tell you that he did give Kathy cocaine. You're going to hear evidence that Kathy, like a lot of people, and it's going to be important for you to understand as jurors, that this is 1982 in New York City. And Mr. Durst and his family, because of their business connections, because of their real estate connections, this is back Studio 54, Xenon, the big clubs, and Xenon was in a Durst building. So Bob Durst could basically walk up with whoever he wanted, he could just go in. And the evidence will show, without question, that Kathy appreciated the lifestyle that she had with Bob Durst. No question. The evidence is also going to show that Kathy Durst was just about to graduate from medical school. She was not a drug addict. She was a well-functioning doctor who had put her life somewhat back together after the incidents with Peter Schwartz and Dr. Halperin shortly before. Susan Berman was interviewed by Detective Struck, and she tells Detective Struck that Kathy would use Quaaludes, and that she thinks that the disappearance had something to do with drugs. Friends say that she's spending $1,000 per week on drugs. That's the story that Susan Berman is peddling. Now, the evidence is going to show it's not true. Kathy Durst doesn't have $1,000 a week to spend on drugs. Kathy Durst is borrowing money to pay for her tuition, and Kathy Durst is going to medical school, doing rotations, and dealing with patients and getting good evaluations as she prepares to graduate and start her residency. Now, they also spread similar negative stories to the press. Bob Durst talked to the press a few months after his wife's disappearance, said she had some sort of quasi-breakdown, she was doing badly in medical school, she was doing badly in her life, she was unhappy. The evidence is going to show that it's not true. Did somebody? Oh, I'm sorry. I thought someone said something. I apologize. Also, the statements were spread that Kathy had she was using cocaine, and she probably got her involved with bad elements who were somehow responsible for her disappearance. This is the story that was being peddled. Durst said his wife drove a flashy red Mercedes and wore expensive clothing and diamond earrings and drew attention to herself. And then it's going to show that Kathy was kind of a more like a granola type of woman, not like a fancy, you know, pearls, etc. But that's what was being spun to the press. Now, the version of events, the summary of what Durst originally said was, on October 31st, 1982, Kathy and Durst were together in South Salem. They had a pushing and shoving argument. He put her on a train back to the city. He then visited the mayor's. He spoke with her by phone that evening. Her disappearance was her own fault. She was never heard from again. Now, when we eliminate the statements that only come from Durst and Susan Berman, or those that have otherwise been discredited, what remains of this statement? On January 31st, 1982, Bob Durst and his wife were together in South Salem that evening when she came home. They had a pushing and shoving argument. She was never heard from again. Your Honor, I don't know when the court is a break, but this is a good time if it works for the court.
It is a good time. Thank you, Mr. Berman.
Everybody doing okay? No one's falling asleep yet? I'm watching y'all. Again, like I said at the beginning, I'm just every once in a while gonna interject this. There's a lot of material to cover. I want to make sure that when the evidence comes up at trial and it's out of order, that you understand completely what I've got. And I want to make sure that in my opening that the defense is given notice of this is what I'm going to prove. So with that, so other than the stories initiated by Durst and Susan Berman, is there any other evidence that reasonably demonstrates that Kathy Durst made it back to New York, to the city, to the penthouse? The last person allegedly to have had contact with Kathy was Dr. Albert Cooperman, who was the Associate Dean at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine. Dr. Cooperman is yet another witness who you're going to hear from by videotape, by computer. Dr. Cooperman is almost 90 years old. He testified a couple of years ago. But you're going to hear him, and what he's going to tell you is he's going to explain to you that on Monday morning, there's evidence that he received a call between 9 a.m. and 11 a.m. from someone who identified themselves as Kathy, saying that she had diarrhea and would not be making it to school that day. Now, telephone records from the Durst 37 Riverside Drive penthouse for that Monday do not show any such call. Now, as a fourth-year medical student about to graduate, Kathy was no longer taking classes at medical school. So what you'll hear from the doctors who are going to testify is that the way things work at Albert Einstein is that the first 2 years you're basically in class. Then the next 2 years you are doing rotations. And that's how doctors figure out what they're going to do. They might do an orthopedic rotation, and they say, I really like orthopedics. And then they think, I want to be an orthopedist. I want to be an orthopedist at this hospital. So they do a sub-internship at that particular hospital. So Kathy was doing rotations her fourth year. And remember, this happens in January. She is going to be graduating in a few months, and she'll be off. In July, beginning of July, she would have started her career as a doctor. So on Monday, February 1st, Kathy was scheduled to begin her rotation at the outpatient pediatric clinic at Bronx Memorial Hospital, which is the same, that's Jacoby, just the former name. Dr. Sophie Bach, who ran the clinic, will testify that Kathy never showed up for the rotation and never called. She's going to tell you that in her 40 years, and I want to be clear, and this is what happens with these old cases. So she did not have 40 years of training medical students when this happened in 1982. But because she's testifying now, meaning now she'll be actually in court, she's able to now explain to you that, okay, in my 40 years, some before, a little bit before Kathy disappeared and some after, I've never had a student where this has ever happened, where they just never showed up, never called, not once. Dr. Peter Halpern, again, will testify, and he will explain the clinical rotations.
You're on the clinical rotation, you're not in a class, you're not even on the campus of the medical school, you're in some clinical setting at a hospital or outpatient clinic. and your sort of line of reporting and your relationship is with the teaching doctors at that service that you're assigned to.
Now, then it's going to show that one of the areas Kathy was very interested in for her residency was pediatrics. And as a fourth-year medical student about to graduate, you are given a fair level of responsibility. You're not a doctor yet, but in essence, you're being counted on as part of the team at this clinic. You don't just not show up. It's what the evidence is going to demonstrate. Now, they're going to come in, many of Kathy's medical school classmates, and they're going to tell you that she would have called, absolutely, the rotation itself to say, you know what, I'm not going to be here today. I'm sick.
Any medical student would know, especially fourth year, not the first day of the very first rotation in the third year, that the person to communicate that you're going to be absent with is the team that you're being assigned to as a clinical rotating student. And that they need to know that you're not going to be there, not just because you're sort of missing class, the way that might happen, in anatomy, because you know that you're really part of a clinical team, and that you might have patients assigned, and that they need to know that those patients need to be reassigned, etc. And that's the person that you call.
So the evidence is going to show that even if Kathy would have, for whatever reason, called the dean of the medical school to say she was going to miss her rotation, it wasn't the dean who was expecting her. And you're going to hear from all these doctors, they're all going to tell you that there's no way that you're not going to call the attending or another student in that class because in that rotation, because they're expecting you to be there, and Kathy is a couple of months from getting her letter. It's kind of like showing up, not showing up for something really important, and you're going to then have to ask these people, can you recommend me for a spot here? So that's what the evidence is going to show.
Well, because medical students don't want the dean to know that they missed the day of a rotation, and there's absolutely no other way of the dean knowing. It's not like attendance is taken and that information is sent back to the dean's office.
So Dr. Halpern's going to tell you that, listen, for Kathy to have called the dean, it would be analogous to me calling the district attorney to say I'm not going to be at work today instead of my boss or whoever I'm going to be working with. And Dr. Halpern's going to tell you, as are a number of other physicians, it just doesn't make sense. That's what the evidence will show. Now, during the original investigation, Dr. Cooperman assumed, and the investigators accepted it, that in fact it was Kathy he had spoken to on the phone. Now the evidence is going to show that that was an absolutely incorrect assumption. During the original investigation, there were certain important questions that Dr. Cooperman was never asked.
Your interactions personally with Kathleen Durst over the course of her entire medical career were approximately 10 minutes, whatever.
5 to 10 minutes.
5 to 10 minutes.
Right.
Okay. Had you ever spoken with her on the telephone before?
No.
Had you ever heard her voice on an intercom before?
No.
Had you ever heard her voice on a recording of any kind whatsoever before?
No.
So, are you able to say, based on the voice, that it was or wasn't Kathy Durst?
No.
Why did you think it was Kathy Durst calling?
She said she was Kathleen Durst.
She said she was Kathleen Durst. So, other than a woman call with a female voice, and this person said they were Kathy Durst, was there anything else about that call itself that told you this is definitely Kathleen Durst?
No.
So the evidence is going to show that Dr. Cooperman assumed that if somebody calls and says, "This is Kathy Durst, and I'm not going to be making it to my rotation today," that it was Kathy Durst. But when he was asked further questions, the evidence demonstrates that he had probably talked to her 5 to 15 minutes her entire 4 years of medical school. He never spoke to her on the phone. He didn't know her voice. That's what the evidence is going to demonstrate.
Have you ever been asked by any police officer, any detective, any prosecutor, have you ever talked to them on the phone before?
No.
Have you ever been asked by any police officer, any prosecutor, any detective, prior to meeting Mr. Boone and I and Detective Shanley, have you ever talked to her on the phone before?
No.
Prior to meeting us, have you ever been asked, how long have you talked to her in total over the 4-year period?
I don't believe I was asked that.
Who was the first person or group of people to ask you those types of questions?
You and John Bowman.
Now, the evidence is going to demonstrate that the reason that the dean was called was because Bob Durst did not know where Kathy was going to be that day. He did not know what hospital, he did not know what rotation. And you're going to get that information directly from Bob Durst during the 2015 interview in New Orleans.
If Kathy wasn't going to come in to, let's say she was unavailable, she was sick, etc. What you would have known is that she would need to call, the dean's office to say, "Hey, I can't come in," right?
She would need to call somebody.
Do you know who she would call? Do you have any idea?
No.
Now he expands a little more.
But you would have known, hey, she could always call the dean of the medical school, right? You would know that, right?
Yeah.
So if Kathy didn't make the call to Dr. Cooperman, who did? Shortly after the call to Dean Cooperman was made, and multiple times over the years, Susan Berman discussed the fact that she had made the call. She discussed it with a number of friends, and you're going to hear that testimony. Miriam Barnes was Susan's friend and neighbor in 1982 at Beekman Place in a very small apartment that Susan had in a very nice address, tiny apartment, great address in Manhattan. Miriam Barnes was another tenant in either that building or the next building. And she's going to tell you, you're going to hear from her again by videotape, what happened and what she remembers.
I got the phone call from Susan to come up to her apartment right away.
What exactly did she say when she was summoning you up to her apartment?
She needed to talk to me.
Was there anything out of the ordinary about the way she summoned you up to her apartment?
There was a sense of urgency. She was. It took her a while to get it out. She was very nervous, and when Susan got nervous, she would pick at her lip, and she said, "I did something today," and did it for Bobby, and then her next statement was, "If anything ever happened to me, Bobby did it."
Now the evidence is going to show that something was not going to happen to her for another approximately 18 years. But eventually, the evidence will show that the defendant cleaned up a loose end.
Eventually, at some point, did you read about, hear about in the media Kathleen Durst's disappearance in New York?
Yeah.
And was it a big story at the time in New York?
Yeah.
And did you, that time period that you read and heard about it, was that generally the same time period that this conversation took? Like the same year?
Yes, of course.
Okay. Within the same weeks?
Yeah.
Now, Miriam Barnes' story is going to come out in an unusual fashion. The evidence is going to show that she doesn't first give the information to law enforcement. She has a friend who is going to testify, who she grew up with, who happened to be a reporter for the New York Times and also a lawyer. And that Miriam contacts him wanting to know what to do. And this is going to happen many years later. And he's going to testify that she was very afraid, and she came to him in confidence. She did not want to go to the authorities at the time, and she did not want her story told. You're going to hear further evidence that she did eventually tell her story to a New York Times reporter named Charles Bagley, and that Mr. Bagley ended up printing that story. And it was only after he had spoken to her friend had spoken to her, that we ended up speaking to her and getting the story that you just heard. Now, you're going to see Miriam Barnes' testimony, and the evidence is going to show that this is not somebody who wanted to come to court, who wanted to share what she knew. You're going to also hear from Lorraine Newman. Now, Lorraine Newman has been a friend of Susan since 1976 when they first met in New York City. And Lorraine Newman is also, for those of you who remember the original Saturday Night Live, she's one of the original Saturday Night Live primetime players. She's going to testify. She's going to tell you that she's a very private person, that she does not want to be involved in this case. She has never wanted to be involved in this case. But she's going to come in here and she's going to tell you what she knows.
The question, the way that she said it to you, was she in essence saying, hey, listen, Bob was with me, so therefore he couldn't have done this? Or was she saying it in the context of, basically, I provided Bob an alibi, whether or not...
No, she said she provided an alibi.
And in the way that she said it, was it in the context of that was an actual alibi or something she was doing for him that wasn't true?
Something she was doing for him because he was her friend and she loved him.
You're going to hear from a number of witnesses who are going to tell you a version that Susan told them about what had happened. And what the evidence is going to show is that Susan was very deliberate in who she told and in how much she told different people. And that depending on who the friend was, if it was somebody that would think badly about her for what she had done, she might not say anything. But the common denominator, what the evidence is going to show is she told a version of this story to more than half a dozen people. Now you're going to hear from Linda Obst. And Linda's going to testify about similar comments that Susan made to her. She and Linda go way back. Susan wrote, the evidence will demonstrate, a book that was basically, gosh, I'm sitting up here, I can't believe I'm blanking out on the name. What is it?
Easy Street.
Thank you. Easy Street, which was basically, it was the story of her father being a gangster and how she found out about it as an adult. And it became, was a big hit. Susan, again, as I had said, evidence will demonstrate, she really peaked very early. This came out in around 1980. And Susan, in the course of this, ended up deciding that she wanted to move to Los Angeles to become a screenwriter. And Linda Obst, who at that time had been a reporter previously, Linda Obst got into production. And this was basically Linda Obst's first project. She was brand new in film development. And what Linda was doing is she was working with Susan to develop the script based on Easy Street. Now, Linda Obst is going to testify. And Linda Obst, the evidence is going to show, is a major now Hollywood producer. The evidence is going to demonstrate that she's produced numerous movies that you've all heard of and likely seen. She's going to testify that she doesn't want to be here, has had her 15 minutes of fame, and the last thing that she wants is to come into court and testify in a high publicity murder case. But she's going to tell you that here's what happened, and this is what Susan told me. She's going to say that during the course of working on the screenplay, Susan made what seemed like a very innocuous comment. And at the time, Linda's going to tell you that Susan was not easy to work with. And the evidence that's going to come out at trial is Susan was a very high-maintenance individual. She was someone who will be described as a very good friend, but as somebody that if you were her friend, she could be a handful. She's very needy. And Linda's going to testify that working on this screenplay was a nightmare. She's going to tell you that, you know what, it was her first project, that in hindsight, she should have had the strength to say, you know what, Susan, you can't write this screenplay, it's too close. But she said it was her first project and she made some errors. And one of the ways she's going to say she dealt with it was that she would somewhat tune Susan out. She would listen, but she would not listen sometimes as carefully. So Linda ends up remembering this innocuous comment. And this is what she remembers, and this is what she's going to testify to.
She once told me that she called Albert Einstein Medical Center for him and said she was Kathy. It came up in the context of she did the sorts of things for Bobby that Gladys did for Davy. And the example that she gave was that when Bobby was asked her to or needed her to, she made this phone call to Albert Einstein in Kathy's name.
Linda explained her motivation for testifying.
In terms of publicity for yourself, given your position and what you do, is this the kind of thing that is in any way helpful to your career?
On the contrary.
Can you explain?
It is not good for a movie producer to be associated with a murder trial.
And in the end, if I were to ask you, can you tell us, why are you here?
For justice.
Susie Harmon was another close friend of Susan's. They met when they were in the 6th grade. Susie is going to tell you what Susan Berman said to her.
He said something about there was something on the stairs and he was going to be... I just remember there was a stairway involved conversation and...
You said he was going to be blamed. Did she, in discussing this, did Susan reference that it involved Kathy? Or her discipline?
Yes.
Okay.
They had a fight. Well, it was something about helping. I mean, it's almost like I kind of didn't want to hear it because it was something that she had done. It was like, why are you telling me this? She was telling me something very excitedly. And then it was not something that I could ask her too much about. You know, it was like, it wasn't like she just was telling me there was an accident. This is what I recall. There was an accident. Okay. Bobby was going to be blamed. She helped him so there wouldn't be blame.
Now, I want to be clear what the evidence is going to show and what it's not going to show. The evidence is going to show that Susan told these people versions of the story that she had made the call to Albert Einstein to help Bob Durst. She was very clear in these calls, she's very clear in these conversations, that Bob Durst, or at least what she had been told by Bob Durst, was not that this was a killing, an intentional murder, etc., that it was some kind of accident, something that happened, and she had to help Bob. So I want to make sure that you understand, the people are not going to present evidence that Bob Durst told Susan Berman, I murdered my wife, I need you to help me. What the evidence is going to be is Bob Durst killed his wife, and then he told Susan Berman that it was in essence some kind of accident, etc., and I need your help. And that's what occurred. Your understanding is that Susan is telling you that something happened with Bob and Kathy where she was not there, that involved an accident and a fall, and then she had to help Bobby afterward.
Right, and she said she had done something that would make it all right for him.
You're going to hear from Mela Kaufman. Now, Mela Kaufman, and I'm going to explain a little bit later in the opening what the relationship is, but just as a preamble, Susan ends up dating a man named Paul Kaufman. And Paul has 2 children, Mela and Sarah. Sarah is older. They're teenagers, even younger when they start dating. When they break up, which again I'll get into in more detail, Susan became very close to both of those kids. Susan never had children of her own. So Mela was basically Susan's daughter. That's why she is in quotation marks. And Mela is going to tell you about a conversation that she had with Susan.
It was a story of one of her dear friends who I was familiar with, but probably had not met at that point. His wife disappeared, and she told it in a very sensationalistic way. And then, explained, again, generally details are foggy, that she had been the alibi, which was very common in her, my knowledge of her, right? That this was sort of part of her role in the world, that she would step in and show her dominance and power in the world by saving and helping people, and did not really have concerns with law. And so she stepped in as an alibi, and she told it in a sensationalistic way, and there was something about calling the next one.
So though she told, again, some of her friends about the call to the dean, she didn't tell everybody. There are close friends that Susan did not discuss this with. And some of those friends are going to testify. And they're going to tell you that Susan knew me, who I was. And if she would have told me, I would have told her, you have to go to the police. I would have looked down on her. And they're going to tell you that Susan never explained, never went into this situation with them. They're also going to tell you that Susan was very protective of Bob Durst. And this is something that she consistently related to their mutual friend, Nick Chavin.
Susan said to me specifically that Bob killed Kathy, and I said, no, he didn't. And she said, yes, he did. And we argued about that, and she said, we love both of them. Kathy's gone. We love Bob. We need to protect him. Bob killed Kathy. I said, how do you know? She said, he told me.
A theme of these witnesses, and particularly with Nick Chavin, is going to be that Susan made very clear to him on repeated occasions that Kathy's gone. We can't help her. We love Bob. He's here, and we need to protect him. Now, with other friends, Susan was less direct, but still communicated that Durst had killed Kathy.
And I asked her, so what do you think really happened? And she said, again, this is not a quote, so this is kind of the gist of what she said, but it was definitely something I remembered. She said, I'm a gangster's daughter, so I have different standards for my friends than other people do, and I don't have that many friends. But I think probably he killed her.
That was Danny Goldberg, who was a close friend of Susan's, who was a record producer. He and Susan had dated, and he again is explaining, I want to make sure it's clear, he is saying there, when he's saying, but I think probably he killed her, That's what he is saying Susan said to him. He's not giving his own opinion. He's just repeating what he was told. Now, with other friends like Robin Morse, Susan was so protective that she would not provide them with even Durst's name.
Did Susan tell you that she had stuck with this close friend through him being accused of involvement in his wife's disappearance?
Yes.
Did Susan ever tell you, or did she imply to you, that she had information about this friend's wife's disappearance?
Yes.
And what specifically did she say or imply or give you the impression about with respect to her knowledge of this wife's disappearance?
She simply told me she had the inside story.
And as you sit here, do you remember the exact words she used?
No.
These comments about the friend's missing wife and her statements about speaking to somebody about what had happened, did those come up near the time that she was murdered?
Yes.
Do you remember speaking to Susie sometime in December of 2000?
Yes.
And do you recall, during that conversation, do you recall Susan bringing up this issue of the friend's missing wife and the knowledge she had about the case?
Yes.
What do you remember about that?
I remember that she brought it up in the beginning of the conversation, and I was uncomfortable. I didn't want to talk about it simply because it was a hard thing to talk about, and she was getting more nervous. And I sort of tried to distract her, and then she came back to it. And I finally said to her, "Susie, what are you talking about?" And she said, "Robbie, I'd tell you, but your life would be in danger."
So where was Bob Durst, and what was he doing at the time that Kathy allegedly disappeared? So we go back to February of 1982. So remember, Kathy disappears. She's last seen alive at the party at Gilberta's on Sunday, January 31st. Monday, the evidence will show, was February 1st. Now, Durst told Detective Struck that he got up about 7 a.m. and that he left around noon. When he spoke to Detective Struck, he gave a very detailed version of everything that he did, which you will see. He said that he may have called his office several times collect. Now, phone records confirm there are 2 collect calls that were made from the South Salem residence, and those go to the business, the Durst organization, a subsidiary in New York City. Now, the fact that Durst called collect will actually prove to be significant evidence in this case.
But someone said that you used to call the office collect.
Oh, all the time.
Tell me about that.
I would call the office collect.
Why did you do that?
I didn't want to pay for it. Let Seymour pay for it. The only reason I'm calling is because he wants me to call.
Remember, Seymour is Bob's father, who at that time was the head of the Durst organization. The evidence is going to show that Bob is calling collect because Bob is cheap. Now, Bob's younger brother, Douglas, is going to testify that at this time in 1982, the only individuals who their office would accept collect calls from were he and his brother, Bob. Now, in addition, at the time Kathy disappeared, Durst provided Detective Struck, again, with this detailed account of his alleged whereabouts and activities. The evidence is going to show that Durst omitted a purchase Monday morning at the local Caldor store. Now, Caldor, you're going to hear evidence, was an all-purpose discount store. It was about the closest store of that kind if you were going to leave South Salem, where everybody knows each other, to where they were living at the time. And you're going to hear evidence that Calder sold cleaning products. Calder was about 20 minutes from the South Salem residence. Despite the fact that Bob Durst was able to give this very detailed version of everything that he had done, he never mentioned the trip to Caldor. There's been a stipulation that you will be receiving in this case that Bob Durst made a purchase at that store on February 1st. You're not going to have any information or evidence about what he purchased, but that's what you will have. Now, Bob Durst said that he returned to the 37 Riverside Drive penthouse Monday evening and that he saw evidence that Kathy had been there. There was a Coke bottle on the table and little things appeared to be moved. The newspaper had been brought in. Now remember, the evidence is going to show that the time Bob Durst is giving this statement to Detective Struck, he is still back on the now admitted lie that he had spoken to Kathy Sunday night after she had arrived home. Tuesday, February 2nd, Durst told Detective Struck that on Tuesday he drove to Connecticut to look at land parcels. And he's basically saying he's looking at land parcels for the Durst organization. Douglas Durst is the head of the Durst organization. Douglas Durst is going to tell you, he's going to explain to you whether or not there was any even possibility that Bob Durst, his brother, would have been looking at land parcels for their company.
Week after Kathy disappeared, on Tuesday, Bob said he drove across the West Chester Expressway looking at land and buildings. And my question is that something that Bob was doing at that time? So I want to have you rate the idea that Bob was out looking at property across the West Chester Expressway. What would be your response? It's not true. And how certain are you that that would be true? Very certain.
So Douglas Durst is going to testify that he is very certain that's a lie. It's not true. Now, Durst added at the time that while he was in Connecticut on Tuesday, he called the office regarding business. We know from Bob Durst himself that Bob always called the office collect. However, on the Tuesday that Durst claimed to have called the office from Connecticut, there is no record of such a call. Does not exist. Did not happen. However, there were 4 collect calls that were made and accepted from southern New Jersey. Now, these collect calls were made from 3 payphones on the Jersey Shore, which is basically a 2-hour drive from the Durst South Salem residence. You can see South Salem at the top. There's Beach Haven. One of the calls was made from a laundromat. Now, the payphones were all adjacent to the Pine Barrens. For any of you who ever watched The Sopranos, the Pine Barrens is kind of famous. The Sopranos would always bury people at the Pine Barrens because the evidence is going to demonstrate that the soil at the Pine Barrens is sand. It doesn't freeze. And when you kill somebody in the middle of winter and you want to bury them, you need to have sand that you can dig into. So this is a notorious mafia burial ground. Now, in the week after Kathy disappeared, Kathy's sister Mary Hughes and Mary's husband Tom searched the Durst South Salem residence. They're going to say that while searching the bedroom trash can, Tom Hughes is going to tell you he found a piece of paper. This piece of paper has become known as the dig note. There is a stipulation. Bob Durst has admitted by stipulation he wrote that dig note. The note says the following: And what is on the right side is not what Mr. Durst wrote. That is just the translation of what's there. Town dump, bridge, dig, boat, other, shovel, or, and it says check, car, and it's either trunk or truck rentals. Now, Mr. Durst was confronted about this during the last interview with Jarecki and Smerling on April 18, 2012.
Town, dump, bridge, dig, boat, other, shovel, or check, car, truck, rental. So this is my handwriting. Now, I have a feeling there's something out here. I have no idea what that means, what I was writing. And she found this in the trash around the time when Kathy disappeared?
Yeah. So,
did she figure it all out? Town dump bridge. I don't even know where the town dump is up there. They collected garbage. We never took anything to a dump.
Yeah, I mean, I think what she said to the police was, well, this was the list that Bob made after Kathy was dead. These were his options on what to do with the body.
The town dump or the bridge or the boat. We had a sailboat on the lake.
I'm skipping a slide, Your Honor.
Yes.
And that slide I'm skipping, just for the record, is 255.
Thank you.
On Friday, February 5th, Durst reported Kathy missing to the 20th Precinct in Manhattan. When he filed the missing persons report, he described the jewelry that Kathy had allegedly been wearing. Diamond earrings. Now, Mary Hughes, Kathy's sister, is going to testify that Kathy did not have a lot of jewelry, but she did have a particular pair of diamond earrings that she wore all the time. She's going to tell you that about a month after Kathy disappeared, she would find these very earrings, the earrings that Kathy, according to Bob Durst, was wearing when she disappeared, that she would find them inside the Durst Riverside Drive penthouse. Now, on February 8th, the media got a hold of the story. So, remember, she disappears on the 31st. Bob Durst makes the report on February 5th. And on the 8th, let me back up. He made it on Friday. I need to do my math. 1, 2, 3, 4. If I said February 4th, he made the report on Friday, the 5th. And on February 8th, that's when the media first got a hold of it. And it was a big story. Now that same day, February 8th, this is only a week after Kathy disappeared. Karen Minatello, remember, she's the property manager of the East 86th Street apartment where Kathy is living. And she's going to tell you about an eerie discovery that she made.
They told me that the compactor was all jammed up, so I went down into the basement, into the compact room, and the porters were pulling out clothes, books, personal possessions that were jamming up and broke the machine.
And aside from clothing, you said, and books, can you tell me what else that you saw or that you remember seeing?
There was notebooks, there was, personal items, hair dryers, makeup, clothing.
Okay. And did you make an attempt to try to identify whose belongings those might have been in the trash compactor?
Yeah, I picked up a book.
Yeah. What type of book? Like a notebook?
I think it was a notebook or a textbook.
Okay. And what did that tell you?
It had Kathy's name in it.
Kathy Durst?
Yes. I'd never observed that before. When people threw out trash. Not clothing and books. And those items aren't supposed to go down the compact disc, and she packs precious things.
Okay, well, is it fair to say that during your many years as a building manager that you've dealt with jam compactors before?
This is the only one I remember that was significant.
Okay, and why is it that you remember this one over over any other incident?
I mean, who does that?
That does what?
Whose wife, whose loved one is missing, and they throw up their stuff?
Now, the evidence will show that these items, Kathy's medical school books, Kathy's property, was thrown away, jamming up the compactor 1 week after she disappeared. Now, the evidence is going to show that Mr. Durst is the person who had access to that apartment and who got rid of those materials. And the evidence is going to further show that, unlike most people who the stages of grief, denial, and anger, and bargaining, Mr. Durst went right into acceptance. So she's not coming back. And the evidence will show that he threw those materials out because he knew Kathy was not coming back. Now, you're also going to hear from Elizabeth Jones. Elizabeth Jones was the cleaning lady for the South Salem residence at the time of Kathy's disappearance. Not to be confused with Janet Fink, who we talked about before, who had been the cleaning lady previously. So Elizabeth Jones is going to tell you, she's going to testify about a conversation she had with Bob Durst.
He throws everything of Kathy's out. All her medical books, her sewing machine, her clothes. He tells me, just take everything and do a junk job, just get it out of here. So I kind of felt like it was Christmas because I'm just going through this stuff and I can't believe he's throwing all this stuff out. Who would throw all this stuff out? He threw everything out.
And again, Karen Minatello was the manager of the East 86th Street apartment. Elizabeth Jones is the housekeeper at the South Salem residence. So the two places where Kathy's spending time, East 86th Street, her stuff is thrown out. South Salem, her stuff is thrown out. And these include her medical books, things that she's going to need. The evidence can show, again, that Bob Durst knew Kathy was not coming back. On February 18th, Mary and Tom Hughes met Durst at his invitation at a Manhattan restaurant. Now, Mary and Tom are going to tell you that originally, they really tried to give Bob Durst the benefit of the doubt as much as they could. She's going to tell you that contrary to what Bob Durst had previously said to Detective Struck, he told Mary that he had not spoken to Kathy after she allegedly arrived back at Riverside Drive. That, based on what Mr. Durst reported years later, the evidence can demonstrate is the truth. But it also demonstrates that Mr. Durst, even when it comes to murder, doesn't make the effort to keep track of his various stories. And as you look at the evidence as it's going to come out with respect to Susan Berman and with respect to Morris Black and with respect to Kathy, it's going to be a continuing theme. Now, also contrary to what he previously told Detective Struck, Durst told Mary that when he arrived at the Riverside Drive penthouse on Monday, he had seen a dirty coffee pot. Remember, before it was a Coke bottle. Again, the small details, can't keep track of them. Mary said that as they left the restaurant, Bob Durst literally offered to let them have the 86th Street apartment. Now, this is February 18th. Kathy's been missing for 17 days, and Bob Durst is giving away her, it's a good rental, the apartment. She's going to say that she was completely unnerved by the timing of the offer. Now, while Kathy's family did everything they could do to assist in the investigation, within 3 months of her disappearance, Bob Durst quit cooperating with the authorities who were looking for his missing wife. Now, the investigation eventually stalled and was allowed to fade away. On February 7th, 1983, Bob Durst filed an affidavit with the Surrogates Court regarding Kathy's estate. The Surrogate Court is in New York. It's basically what you would do to probate an estate. So he's basically filing an affidavit dealing with, Kathy's assets. Durst made certain factual assertions under oath, under penalty of perjury. I have not disposed of any of Kathy's belongings or personal property, and the allegations to the contrary made in Mary Hugh's affidavit are false. Today, we know that's not true. I never threatened her life or threatened her in any way or assaulted Kathy or caused her any physical harm or abuse. The only testimony to the contrary is in Mary Hugh's affidavit, in which she attempts to relate an incident at a Christmas party, and that's false. Now we know, because you've heard Mr. Durst now admit it, that the abuse happened repeatedly. He said in this affidavit, under penalty of perjury, at no time did Kathy and I discuss divorce. The affidavit is just one perjurious statement after another, and that's what the evidence is going to demonstrate. Now, in late 1994, Bob Durst, as the oldest son in the Durst organization, so the way it worked was that Bob's father, Seymour, had become the trustee. The trustee is a very important member of the Durst organization because that person basically controls the trusts which control the Durst organization. And Bob's father, Seymour, was the trustee. And the way things worked in the Durst family is Bob, as the oldest son, was supposed to take over. But Seymour Durst and his brothers realized that Bob Durst was not suitable, and he was passed over in favor of his younger brother Douglas. Now this would lead to a level of hatred and hostility that Bob Durst continues to harbor to this day.
Douglas wanted to take my birthright, he wanted to run the company, he wanted to take my money, and he did those things.
In response, Bob Durst quit the company, left New York City, and moved to Trinidad, California. He did so without even telling his close friend, Nick Chavin, and another close friend, Doug Oliver, that he had left. He just took off and was gone. Yeah. I need a moment, Your Honor, actually. Yeah. Got to start up. Okay. Thanks. Everybody still with me?
Yes.
Thank you. In 1981, Susan's autobiographical novel Easy Street was published, describing her life growing up as a mafia princess. In 1983, after selling Easy Street to Hollywood, Susan moved back to Los Angeles with hopes of becoming a screenwriter. With the proceeds from selling her book, she bought a house at 12030 Coin Street in Brentwood. In June of 1983, Susan married a man named Mr. Margulies. June of 1983. That would be the peak of Susan's life. She was successful. She was marrying somebody she cared about. And from that day forward, her life was going to head in a downhill spiral. Bob Durst attended the wedding.
Well, she got married, it went nowhere, but I walked her down the aisle to her wedding. We saw each other frequently when I would be out there, but it's just different when you're not nearby. We used to see each other when she was in New York, and it would be a several times a week.
Now, although Susan was unaware of it at the time, again, this would be the peak of her life, Mr. was addicted to drugs, and Susan would reluctantly divorce him later that same year. The marriage didn't even last a year. In 1986, Mr. died of a heroin overdose. He would turn out to have been the love of Susan's life. In 1987, Susan began dating Paul Kaufman. Paul Kaufman was an old classmate of Susan's who she had met years earlier when they had attended what was then the Chadwick boarding school in Palos Verdes. Susan essentially became mother to Paul's young children. They were teenagers. I think Mella was a little bit younger. That's Mella on the right, that's Sarah on the left. And although she never formally adopted them, she basically referred to them as her children. Now, Paul and Susan invested all of Susan's money into a project Paul wanted to do, which was a stage version of the Dreyfus Affair that Paul was trying to produce on Broadway. There's an old saying, and apparently it applies to Broadway musicals and it applies to horse racing. What's the best way to become a millionaire on Broadway? Start with $1 billion. And unfortunately, Paul Kaufman lost all of Susan's money. It never opened, and he lost it all. With Susan's money gone, Paul left her. But he kept his kids behind, and Susan took care of the children, even though they were not married. There's no legal relationship. So Paul left, Susan basically got the kids. By 1997, Susan had lost her home in Brentwood. And she rented a small, now run-down house at 1527 Benedict Canyon Drive near Beverly Hills. Now the sad part was, this was the same house that Susan had rented when she first came to Los Angeles in 1983, when the house was in good shape, when her whole career was ahead of her, when she was going to become a screenwriter. And now the house was down and out, as was Susan's career, and as was her life in general. This is what the house looked like at the time that Susan was murdered. She was basically living in squalor. She had 3 dogs, and they were the love of her life. Witnesses are going to tell you that Susan continued to pay for expensive vet care and dog food that she couldn't afford because that was her priority.
You're saying the 5 or 6 years before 2000, you have been helped.
Yes, since the early 90s or so, she had managed to go through her trust money, and she was having very little money. Now, she was leading a very, very low-key lifestyle as opposed to what she usually led. And she was renting this yucky house, and I don't know what it was. It wasn't a whole lot of money, and she was earning some money with royalties, the Easy Street, or whatever you call what she was getting. And she had sold a couple of, what do they call them, treatments or something. Now, she wasn't getting a lot of money, but she was getting some. And I helped her maybe once or twice a year for each of those years.
How much did you usually get?
$25,000.
Now, the evidence is going to show that Bob Durst was not generous with any of his other friends. But for Susan, he was giving her large amounts of money. And the evidence will demonstrate that he was giving her these large amounts of money because Susan had an important secret. Now, Douglas Durst, Bob's brother, was asked about the idea of his brother giving somebody a large amount of money.
You're asking, would my brother give large sums of money to somebody that will trade more than the interest money? No, it doesn't sound like my brother would give large sums of money.
Now, near the time of Susan's murder, her financial situation went from bad to even worse. Stephen Silverman was a longtime friend of Susan's and a fellow journalist.
When you first met Susan, what was her financial situation as you observed it to be?
Well, she had all the right clothes, and she had all the right handbags. She was living in this tiny space on Beekman Place, but it was cute and a good address. Later on, I think with the money from Easy Street, she bought a condo on Beekman Place. So there was money. I never quite knew. There were always rumors. Her father had left her all this money, but she didn't really live lavishly.
Let me ask you, I'm asking, over time, was there a time when Susan ended up making you aware that she was having financial problems?
Oh, toward the end, she was in desperate straits.
Now, Silverman will describe Susan's financial problems near the end of her life.
Susan's financial situation, what did you know about that, especially towards the end?
Toward the end, it was drastic.
Tell me what you know about it.
Well, she called me, I got a frantic phone call, which I saved for a week on my voicemail. I even played it for friends. I said, what do I do? She was manic.
Okay.
She needed money. She wanted me to put her in touch with an agent. She wanted to sell the book. She wanted me to put her in touch with a Broadway composer.
When is this?
Had to be 1999.
Susan's financial situation, what did you know about that, especially towards the end?
Toward the end, it was drastic.
Tell me what you know about it.
Well, she called me, I got a frantic phone call, which I saved for a week on my voicemail. I even played it for friends. I said, what do I do? She was manic.
Okay.
She needed money. She wanted me to put her in touch with an agent. She wanted to sell the book. She wanted me to put her in touch with a Broadway composer.
When is this?
Had to be 1999.
Danny Goldberg, who you're also going to hear his conditional examination testimony, was an ex-boyfriend, longtime friend who had known Susan since the mid-'70s.
Were you aware of Susan's financial situation with respect to her time with Paul Coughlin?
Yes.
And can you tell me what you knew about that?
She was living with Paul Coughlin. I don't know for how long. It seemed to me like it was a few years. And she had a certain amount of savings and spent it, almost all of it, trying to develop a musical theater piece that never came to fruition, and that meant that she was had very little money left.
Did Susan ever come to you for money?
She did.
And did you ever loan her any money?
I did.
How much did you loan her?
I think it was $5,000.
Now, despite Mr. Durst being someone who, you will hear evidence, was very frugal with his money, including himself, he sent Susan a check on March 3rd, 1999 for $25,000. Now, in late 1999, New York State police detectives secretly began reinvestigating Kathy's disappearance. They ended up getting involved in the case because they got a tip that ended up going nowhere, but the investigator who got it, it was enough for him to go back and start re-looking at the case.
So we know now in 2000 that something happened that piqued Janine Pirro's interest and got the Westchester District Attorney, Janine Pirro, interested in you again. Tell me about that.
What was it? Oh, there was new interest in me, and it was Janine Pirro, and the first thing I knew of it, was when there was an article in the Times and the, I don't know if it was the Times and the Post or the Times and the Daily News, and it came out on a Saturday. I was usually the PR guy, he's still around, even though he's ancient, more than Matt's. He had been given a heads up by the reporters for the newspapers, and he had spoken to Douglas had spoken to Wendy had spoken to me, and there's going to be they're bringing up the disappearance. And when it got to me from Wendy, it was that there were going to be newspaper articles. And we should meet with a lawyer. And why am I meeting with a lawyer about newspaper articles? I feel badly for you people because it's going to be here in New York. It's a New York scene. But not really going to affect me very much in Trinidad.
And then did it turn out to affect you? How did it? When did
it blew me away. The divers and the lake and the lawyers told me. I really only had one lawyer, Joel Cohn, with Stroke, and he was their criminal lawyer. He was the wrong criminal lawyer for me. And he said, these people have huge budgets. The fact that they're sending divers into the lake in the middle of the winter, they're taking a wall out of the house. That was in the newspaper article. I mean, they're going to do something. Janine Pirro's got to do something. I never heard the name Janine Pirro before. And I was told about Janine Pirro. Has higher aspirations, wants to run for something big, statewide. She's not going to go into the newspaper and announce that she's doing all this stuff. She's going to have to do something.
And do you know what piqued her interest originally? What got her interest in the case?
Well, I think it was initially a detective up there who got interested in the paper, and I think that there was some, what was it? They arrested a flasher, and he said, oh, let me off, I know all about Durst. And this detective went and started looking into it, who's Durst, and got the file from the New York City police, who can't think of his name, but
Timmy Martin.
Right, all right. So he started investigating and spending.
Oh, sorry, the police officer was Joe Becerra.
That's it, Joe Becerra.
But the flasher was Timmy Martin.
Well, I'm pleased to say I never heard about it. Anyway, so it got upstairs to Janine Pirro. They got this investigation, and this is a rich family, and she must have decided right away, well, this looks interesting. I'm just going to get publicity with this. I can get media attention. And she right away jumped in and kicked him out. He was getting the attention, not her.
Yeah, he came out in that Vanity Fair article at some point. There was a big picture of him, and there was another article in the newspaper about him, and so he got himself into hot water after that. Then I guess Janine Pirro did a press conference in November of 2000, I think it was.
Right after the newspaper articles came out, Janine Pirro jumped into the thing and took credit for the divers and the rest of it and like that.
And what were the divers for?
They were, on Lake Truesdale. I mean, she never said, but obviously they're looking for body parts, looking for something to use as evidence.
So the position was that they were trying to reopen the case.
They were reopening, and we have evidence against this rich guy, Durst.
And what was your reaction to that when you heard about it?
Oh, the article blew me away. In addition to, I had a loft on Green Street, which I kept, and I also had a house up in Ridgefield, Connecticut. And I was told by Wendy this was happening, and I should come here to New York so I could meet with a lawyer. And I went to New York. I wasn't really sure I was going to meet with a lawyer. I mean, a newspaper article. Why do I go to a lawyer with a newspaper article? I came back to New York and I went to my house up in Ridgefield. Saturday morning I got up and went down to the Starbucks and got the New York Times and the Daily, whichever one it was, and it blew me away. Absolutely, totally blew me away. I wasn't the least bit concerned about the details. You searched the lake until you're blue in the face, and you took a wall out of the house, ridiculous. I was concerned when Joel Cohn said that she's going, really far. DAs don't usually start making announcements in the newspaper when the police haven't even charged you with anything. And he said that she's going to go and do something. And then I met with him, and do something was obviously she was going to have to charge me with something. She can't just investigate me and drop me. She'll have to charge me with something. And he was asking me endless questions about the stuff that happened 20 years ago, and rumors back and forth, and this and that.
All right.
that will conclude court for the day.